what's new about this latest attack from President Trump on social media?
Well, it comes at a time when one of his staffers was temporarily removed from Facebook. It comes which we think was mistaken. It comes at the same time as Nunes also has sued Twitter for $250 million.
Congressman Devin Nunes.
That's right, alleging anti-bias against him. So there's a confluence of events once again, and this is just a couple of days after Facebook has gotten in trouble over the shooting, which is tangential to this, but once again, social media is in the spotlight for doing bad things.
Tell us about what happened with the staffer who was, it appeared one of the companies thought he was a bot, right?
That's my sense of it. And as far as I understand, this was it was a mistake. He was temporarily removed, but it's unfortunate the timing here. What's interesting to me is that what Facebook and Twitter will say to you is that we're adhering to our guidelines. People will be removed if they violate our terms of service. They say there is no bias here. And in fact, legal precedent so far has shown when people have brought cases against Twitter and Facebook alleging anti-conservative bias, those cases really haven't made it very far. There hasn't really been this proof provided in the court system that they're being discriminated against.
Facebook saying and apologizing to the White House social media director Dan Scavino, saying it mistook him for a bot. Michael, meantime, you worked for the Romney campaign, the Cruz campaign. What do you make of President Trump's spending here on Facebook and Google, and how does it compare historically to prior candidates?
I think overall it's a very smart move, and the way to look at it is that one, they're an incumbent without a primary challenge, so they're able to allocate resources a lot earlier for the general election than a campaign. A Democrat right now in the primary, they really have to worry about getting out of the primary, and so the president's campaign can focus all of their attention on persuading any kind of swing voters. And right now it's really about building their base and reaching out to those voters, and they can now do that for a 2-year period uninterrupted, which is a big advantage.
The candidates are also spending far more on Facebook than Google, 3 times as much. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, Facebook plays a major role in politics. I think as their platform is really second to none in terms of targeting and ease of use. The other way to look at it, in terms of social video, Facebook accounts for about 80% of social video advertising. When you look at the whole pie of video advertising, it's only about 8% of total when you include television. So there's a lot of room to grow for both Facebook and Google, as well as other channels like connected TV.
Now, Tom, meantime, all of these platforms are battling issues around hate, misinformation. As you mentioned, Representative Devin Nunes has sued Twitter for $250 million in damages and users behind anonymous Twitter accounts that he claims have smeared his name. Well, isn't this a little bit like welcome to Twitter? I mean, haven't many famous people and not famous people had their names smeared on Twitter?
People say a lot of terrible, terrible things about other people on Twitter, and I think we've all experienced it. Anyone who is a even somewhat public figure can understand this, and folks on the right, folks on the left have been victimized, and folks on both sides have been the bullies, if you will.
Is there any precedent for a case like this? Because I wonder, is he onto something?
Well, again, so far, there have been a couple of cases that have made their way into the court system, but very recently, in a case against Facebook, one of the judges appointed by Donald Trump dismissed the case. There hasn't been proof provided that these kinds of activities are going on, and in fact, it's very much in Twitter and Facebook's interest. They've been criticized for this anti-right bias for a long time, and they are going out of their way to try to demonstrate to their audiences that this doesn't exist. And I mean, to me, I look at folks across the political spectrum who seem to have no problem getting their message across. They're not being silenced, and in fact, their voice, Donald Trump, at the beginning, from the beginning, has used Twitter to amplify his voice and amass an increasingly growing following, despite the number of people who say he violates terms of service and he should be kicked off Twitter.
Meantime, I spoke with Trump's 2020 campaign manager, Brad Parscale, last year, and he talked about how they're going to continue to double down on these social media and tech platforms, but watch how they evolve. Take a listen to what Parscale told me.
If you're watching Facebook for 4 hours this year, but next year you're watching 3 hours of Facebook, but 1 hour of YouTube, that changes. So we're going to monitor where eyes are going. I think YouTube continues and Google continues to work on that platform and make improvements. I think what Google's done to the search algorithm also to put YouTube results at the top, they continue to put a lot of focus and they understand the value of that platform. So we're watching it closely. We're using it for a lot of things now. We're using it probably more now than we even were in 2016.
Now, Michael, do you think the scandals and controversies that are impacting Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, do you think that could influence the candidates' ad spend, or do they really have nowhere else to go?
Well, I mean, they have plenty of other options, but I think if the scandals don't impact the user base of these platforms, then the money is still going to flow there from an advertising perspective, whether it be political or non-political.
And do you think the Democratic candidates need to step it up and sort of match what President Trump is doing on these platforms?
Well, remember, they're playing a different game. So for the next 12 plus months, they're in a primary where really their entire voter base are Democrat primary voters. And so you're talking about maybe 20% of total voters is their entire audience to win the primary, whereas the president can think about the general election for the next year plus. And so that's a big advantage. They're talking to completely different audiences. The president's talking to the conservative base and swing voters, and the Democrats are just talking to the Democrat base.